Like I was showing you, this house will be done. I will make sure it gets done. I was working on my stairs, so I've kind of completed out my stairs a little bit more, trying to understand how a piece of geometry coming down, entering into another piece of geometry, how that form looks. But for the most part, I'm trying to keep it relatively simple. I could come in here and bevel my edges, and it can make the piece look better, but it can potentially increase the UV time that it takes to, the time it takes to UV it, and for the bang for my buck, it may not be worth beveling this when, as a whole, it's more about the windows and the treatment that is happening around the door that is more visually interesting than the bevels. So if I look at my pieces of geometry, I have this piece, I have this piece, I have this piece, I have this piece. Eventually, maybe these pieces will be merged with this one. But I'm not necessarily concerned with making things watertight, just because it will require a lot more triangles to merge everything together. I've continued my geometry around to the other side. I can't necessarily see this in my reference, so I'm just making it up. These two pieces, while they look similar, I've added another edge loop internally so that I can get the shading effect of it being a dark shading versus a lighter shading. Here in my reference, I have these cubes that terminate into, like, they're almost like little pyramids, I think, that sit right here. They're kind of small. I'm still debating whether or not to model them. If I didn't model them, then I would just make sure that they're in my texture. And I think generally it'll get the job done. But I haven't decided yet if I want to go either the texture route or the modeling route. So let's look at the stairs. So let's say, if all my modeling's done, I'll start off with one piece and start UVing it. If I select my geometry, I can go into UV and UV editor. My mentality for the UV editor is that if it's in, as I'm creating the UVs, if it's in this 0 to 1 space, it needs to still be done. So after I'm done creating my UVs, my UV shells, I put them out of my 0 to 1 space. So when I click on my entire model, excluding the man, if I click on my entire model at the very end, I shouldn't see any UVs in my 0 to 1 space because they should be all completed out here. Sometimes when you have a texture in here, it's hard to see. So if I press this button right here, it'll turn on and off the image.
What's that called?
Display image on and off. Oh. I will also post, I think I might have seen some of you using it. I'll also post my texture that I use for UVing. Is it in here? No. Is it in here? This UV grid is what I like to use. I'll make sure to post it for you guys. But I will.
I think it's there from texturing the fruit.
Yeah, but not for this class.
Okay.
So there's like 2 of you that may not necessarily have it. You have it.
I have it.
Yeah. Because you guys are in my other class. So I'll make sure it's for this class and up there for this class, just so everyone has it. So I will put that texture into my source images. I'm very experienced in UV mapping, so I actually don't use this texture until when I start doing layout.
Huh.
But since you guys are have not been doing UV mapping for 10 plus years, I would potentially start off with this UV grid.
Maybe this semester.
Huh?
Maybe only this semester.
So I place my texture into my source images folder. I'll open up my Hypershade. And I will create a Lambert material. And I'll go to my checkered box for my color. I'll go
Why
to
not a boolean?
Huh?
Why not a boolean?
A blend,
No, a boolean.
a boolean.
Yeah.
What? A blend? I don't know what a boolean is.
Like a Boolean.
Yeah,
Oh, that option?
boolean.
Just go with texture.
By the way, I wonder. I just have a quick, rapid question.
Yeah.
Why are there so many materials when you only use the, AI standard Lambert and maybe one?
So, why are there so many materials?
Like the ones.
Why is there
like,
so much? Why is there all this stuff that you don't use?
Yeah, is like water even used at all? Anything?
No.
So why are they?
So there's a lot of Maya. So let me see if I can explain this in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Maya is filled with a bunch of stuff. I don't want to use the word stuff, but I'll use the word stuff. Maya is filled with a bunch of stuff. There's new stuff and there's old stuff.
Mhm.
And Autodesk doesn't like to take out the old stuff because they feel like people who may use their applications might still be using the old stuff.
Mm.
And they don't want to deal with the headache of telling people that it's not there anymore. So a lot of this stuff is old stuff that almost absolutely no one uses.
So does anyone use like water and stuff?
You can experiment with it and you can see if you can get good results. But since a lot of this stuff, is maybe materials, but if I scroll down,
Mhm.
they actually have lights in here.
Huh.
They have, as you start to scroll down, these start to become nodes as opposed to shaders.
Hmm.
And the nodes themselves can actually be, see how there's this contrast node?
Yeah.
So if I bring this contrast node in, there is a contrast and a value,
Mhm.
and I can place my texture into this node,
Yeah.
and I can change the contrast value. So imagine this being a pipe.
Uh-huh.
So my texture is being fed through the pipe, and the
Mhm.
pipe is then altering it based on its RGB values.
Oh wow.
So your trees can get really intense,
Mm.
but more often than not, companies tend to write their own stuff and not necessarily use all these nodes. So there's old shaders, there's nodes that you may not necessarily use, and then, yeah, that's why I just always go to the Lambert.
Weird like stone material.
Yeah, just experiment with it. So I'm back to my file, and I'll go to my folder, and I will look up my uvgrid.jpg. I could apply it to my entire model. Tends to be a little hard on the eyes, but I guess I'll just do it.
Can we color all our houses like that?
No. So I applied my material, and when I click on my geometry, by default it'll show up like this. So it's pretty hard to discern, especially when you have a lot more edges in there. It's hard to discern where is an edge of geometry versus where is your grid texture.
Mm.
So by clicking on this button, I can turn it on and off to be able to select
Oh.
things. So I'm not necessarily worried about seeing the texture in here, so I'll turn it off. I'll move this to the side. So I'll click on my geometry. This is a box. 90% of what I'm going to do, I'll just use UV, automatic mapping. And you can see the automatic mapping planes come into the view. There's a top one, side ones, back, front, and a bottom one. So if the geometry is generally facing the direction of that plane, it'll create a shell for it. These are a lot of shells to manage. If there are a lot of complexities like this, one thing that I'll do is I will select all my edges and I'll cut them all. So now each one of these is its own face. I didn't necessarily have to do that, but for me it's easier to start from a known and start sewing edges together to create like a known shell as opposed to
Trying to goof around with all those weird.
yeah, like this shell right here comes down and it cuts in and it comes down and it looks like it might connect somewhere. So when I start sewing edges together, that shell might connect in a weird way. So at least this way I can start face by face managing all the shells together,
Yep.
as opposed to 100% utilizing the shells that are created for me, because I may want a cut right here.
Yeah.
So I'll start off with the largest face, which is this one right here, and I'll move it to the side. And the first thing I'll do is I'll start from this edge and I'll start working my way out. So I'll select this edge, which in turn will select this shell too. It's kind of hard to show everything in this view, but I'll select the edge and I'll click this button, move and sew. And what it's going to do, if you have two shells and you click on move and sew, it is going to move the shell that has the least amount of UVs to it. So now that my shell is comprised of 6 UVs, if I select this edge, it is now connected, or it's showing me that it should be connected to this shell that only has 4. So now that I've started a shell that has more UVs than over here, when I do a move and sew, it'll move that little shell to the larger cell.
Wow.
And I'll just, I think I deleted the face under here. So I did delete the face under here. So I will leave it deleted. I'll do the next face, and I'll select it and go to shell. I want to rotate it clockwise, so if I click on this button, I can click it twice, one for 45 degrees, one for 90 degrees, and I can start to position it. It might jump, but I want, for right now, I'll position it so it's relatively close to this edge, because in 3D space, these edges are right here.
Why did you delete this face?
Because you can't see it. I mean, I could leave it, but you need to be 3 feet tall and looking up to see it.
If you're playing as a small character.
Yeah, if you're playing as a small character, then you want it. But I think it's just habit to delete it. I mean, I did put the geometry right here, so I think it's negotiable if it's there or not. I'm kind of eating my own words because I have a face right here and it's the same angle as here. So
We delete the faces which you can't see just to save memory on the computer, or like to do less UV?
The best thing to think about is if you have a giant piece of geometry down here, it doesn't necessarily have to be, like if the geometry's there, you can make the UVs really small. But if you weren't conscientious of that, it could potentially be taking up a lot of space on your UV sheet, and you can't even see it to begin with.
I see.
There are other technical reasons why people delete faces, but again, that's another lecture, and then I have 20 minutes. So for this, I will show you. I'll click on this geometry, okay, and I'll append polygon tool, this edge right here. So let's say I create a new geometry, and with new geometry means that there is a new UV shell that gets created automatically. But the problem is that it's too big in comparison to my other UV shells. So if I did the exact same approach, if I clicked on this edge, which is, let's see, I need one more edge. So so this guy here. So if I click on this edge, see how this small little edge is actually this, it's connected to this shell right here. So if I did a move and sew,
Whoa,
it's gonna look like that.
that's a big one.
So it tries its best to retain the small UV shell in relationship to the very large UV shell. So this is what I would do. If I know my UV shells had that discrepancy, I will scale down this UV shell so that it is generally the same size. And then I will move and sew.
When you relax it, won't it make it the same size anyway?
When you relax it, it'll make it the correct size, but the very fact that your UV shell is taking up this space means that it's overlapping other shells that you're going to have to adjust. It's like
Filling up your workplace with a ton of junk.
this is a weird analogy. It's like trying to grab a meatball through spaghetti. Like you have to put your hand through all that spaghetti to get what you want. And if my geometry face is super large, it could just create visual clutter in front of other UVs that I don't necessarily want to do. And then it's like, well, okay, if my UV shell is large, I could relax it so that it's straight, but now my entire UVs are going to be larger than all my other UVs that I then need to be sewing to. So it's just a lot easier to just take that face and generally eyeball it and then sew it together and just keep on moving forward.
It's like when you order a burger and ask for no jalapenos, but they put jalapenos in it.
And then you have to go through the burger
Yeah,
to take out the jalapenos.
that happened to me the other day.
So I'm just going face by face, looking at my UV screen, seeing where it sits in 3D space, and start UV mapping it together. Now this actually has a deviation to it. So these faces right here actually come down. So I can do this two ways. I can either select this edge, and I can start to create my UV shell like this. But I wouldn't do that. But you could do this. What I would do is sew this edge right here. And then so, do I want to do that? Let me think about this. Yeah. So in 2017, in early 2017, this relax tool, this unfold UV tool, is not as good as the newer 2017. So if I select this edge, move and sew, and select this edge, move and sew, you'll notice that this portion is overlapping right here. One way to be able to clearly see UV shells overlapping is by clicking on this button right here, this toggle shaded UV display. When you click it, you're going to see geometry that is, when it's dark blue, that means that the same rotated UV shells are overlapping each other. When it's red, that means you have a UV shell. So if I take this UV shell right here, blue means let me rotate this guy. This. So see the number 4? Blue means that if I were to paint a number 4 right here, it would show up correctly. If I flip my UV, it shows that it's red, which red isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it means when I'm texturing, the 4 is actually going to be backwards because the UV shell is flipping. So with that, you have a UV shell that is flipped, and when it's over a blue shell, it turns pink-purple. So it's perfectly fine to have those rotated shells. It's just something that you have to take note of. So I have this edge right here sewn to its neighboring edge. So if I select all my UVs, and if I use my relax tool, it will relax it correctly, but it will always have this this UV overlapping this geometry. With the newer relax tool in 2017, it will actually move this vertice out here. So if I painted, if I look at this edge right here, and if I painted a black square right here, and if I painted a white square right here, then either, depending on what color I end up with, either this corner, let me go to my UVs. This corner right here, this corner is either going to be white because this top part is going to be white, or this face right here is going to be black because I painted into the next UV shell. So that's generally why when you're creating these shells, if you don't want it to share the same color or share the same texture, you want to make sure that your UV shell is not overlapping. But every time I use the relax tool, the unfold UV tool, it'll forever go over there. Yeah.
I noticed that when I used the relax tool in mine,
Mm-hmm.
it does flatten it so it's not overlapping.
For the newer Maya?
Yeah, for the one I have.
Yeah. So for this one, I might just bring it off to the side. It's not the most elegant solution, but it means that since my UVs are so far away, whenever I use my relax tool, they won't be overlapping on top of each other. So I'll continue connecting up my pieces. Do the same thing on this edge right here, where I'll move and sew, move and sew, move and sew, move and sew. I'll do the same thing right here. I'll move and sew this face. I'll move and sew this face as it comes up here. Move and sew, and I'm just traveling across the geometry. So this is another example. So if I select this edge, and if I do a move and sew, then my UVs are going to overlap in this corner. Not necessarily the end of the world because it's kind of pretty far away and you kind of have to directly look at it and for the most part, this face tends to be the same color. But if I didn't want them to overlap, what I could do is I could select this edge right here, and I can sew it together. And then when I do my relaxing, I mean, it's kind of screw up my UV shell, all because of that edge. That I will have control to be able to paint what I want in there, but you can kind of see right here. See how this line is coming down and turns?
Mm.
It's all because of this geometry is a rectangle, but how it's being described as a UV isn't exactly a rectangle.
Mm.
So I'll Control Z backwards so that they are overlapping. And I'll do the same operation where I'll do it not sewn at that edge, and I'll do a relax. You'll notice that the UV shell is still at a 90-degree angle, and the textures that I have right here are completely straight. So that's the biggest thing when you're creating UVs for models, is you're fighting how much stretching you're going to see versus how complex or how many cuts you have on your UV shell. So this corner right here, I think it's fine that it overlaps. That's how I would UV it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can't you like just like make it separate so that it doesn't have to overlap at all?
Can you make it separate?
Yeah.
So that is the other thing, is that if I can make, like, it's completely up to you. Like this whole face right here on the side,
Yeah.
I can make it its own shell.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't necessarily have to deal with that type of stretching.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to have, say, a very specific texture, that was like if I painted a black line that went down here, that went down here, that went down here,
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to paint a black line across this UV shell as opposed to 3 different UV shells.
Mm.
So if I look at this UV shell, and too bad I'm not recording this. But let's say I have 3 different UV shells, and I want a black line to go across it. Now I have to eyeball it and guesstimate where the black line is here or where the black line is here.
Yeah.
And you could be off a lot. You could be off just by a few pixels. And when you see it in 3D, you will see the black line on top here, and you'll see it off a little bit here.
Yeah.
So
Well, I was talking about that part where it, like the corner.
yeah, if this was a separate shell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The corner. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll do it really quick right here. So I have duplicate. Something is wacky with this.
You gotta,
This was happening in another file where if I duplicated, it wasn't assigning the material. Wasn't assigning the default material to the.
For some reason in mine, like sometimes when I extrude, it goes into the menu when you like right click for some reason.
It goes into the menu.
Yeah, like you know when you right click stuff, or when you hold right click. Yeah, it goes into that for some reason when I try to extrude it, or when I try to like move stuff or scale things, it does it.
That one I have to sit down and see
Yeah.
what you mean. So let me cut this here, 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 moving so, moving so. Oops. So I have 3 shells, and this shell doesn't have any stretching. This shell doesn't have any stretching. This shell doesn't have any stretching.
Yeah.
But now when I look at my texture, so see these, because this is one UV shell, my lines match up perfectly.
Oh no. When you click on the thing, when you click on it,
Uh-huh.
I was talking about not cutting it like that, but cutting it along that corner.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, cutting it along that.
So it's the same thing.
Oh, okay.
So I'll do this one too. So I'll move this one here. I'll cut right here.
Yeah.
I'll-
I meant like keep the stuff at the sides of it.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. 1 second.
Yeah.
This is what you mean.
Yeah, like that.
So the same problem. So just like the side right here,
Uh-huh.
it's going to be tricky to line up these. If your texture needs to be lined up on each side,
Uh-huh.
it's going to be tricky to line this up. Looking at here, if I look at here, because these are two different UV shells,
Uh-huh.
it's going to be tricky to line up your texture on different UV shells.
Mm.
Whereas if it's one UV shell, then it's really easy to line up your texture because it's already inherently connected.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So that's the biggest thing is, I mean, theoretically, like every single one of these faces could be its own individual UV shell. Tatiana was doing her chair in Mudbox. And when you do the automatic UVs in Mudbox, it takes every single face and puts it as its own little UV shell.
Ah.
That's fine in Mudbox because the computer understands, it knows what UV shell is what, it knows what vert, it knows what UV is what. But as a human, trying to understand all those cuts is impossible.
Yeah.
So the closer you can get to one entire UV shell will make your life easier while painting, and then it'll also be more recognizable when you see it in Photoshop.
Yeah.
I have 5 minutes. Let's delete that. Let's go here. So let's pretend I just UV mapped this and it's beautiful. Sorry guys.
It's gorgeous.
My UVs sit in my 0 to 1 space. For people who may not know, if I have a texture, my texture sits into this 0 to 1 space, but past this 0 to 1 space, it repeats itself into infinity.
Oh.
And the top, it repeats itself to infinity. Bottom, it repeats itself to infinity. To the left, it repeats itself to infinity. So I will do 2 examples. I'll create a cube that is really long. Actually, it'll just be, I don't want a cube, I want a face. Create it really long. I will freeze transformations. I will select my UVs. I will relax it so it's generally straight. Should be even more straighter. So I'll texture, I'll merge these guys together, edit, delete all my type history. I'll move these verts here. So I have a UV shell that sits in my 0, 1 space, and I have a UV shell that is extending past my 0 to 1 space. So I'll select my UVs in here, and I'll go to polygons and UV snapshot. And I'll start off by renaming it to house out UV. If you have your project set, it'll go into your project folder, into your images folder. Change your size to 2048 by 2048. It's important that the image format be changed to TIFF, and I'll say OK. I'll go into Photoshop, File, Open, Documents, Maya, Projects, Tall House, Images, House Out UV.tiff. I'll go to my window, Channels, and I'll scroll down and I'll delete this alpha 1 that comes along with the TIFF. So I'll just drag and drop it to the trash can. I don't need my channels anymore. I'll press Command I on my layer to invert my texture. I'll then grab my background because it's locked. I'll just grab it and create a new layer. I'll make my background 50% gray. I'll then click on my background copy and I'll change it to multiply. So the reason I do 50% gray is because when I'm looking at my UVs and my texture, it'll help me determine what has been textured and what has not been textured. So I'll come in here and I'm gonna do try and do the quickest texture known to man.
Red with yellow stripes.
I'm gonna do something boring and do blue.
Ooh,
No, yellow. Sorry. So I'll put down my running out of time. Put down my base color. I'll paint the sides a slightly different color. I can create another layer and I can create some wear and tear along the edges. Oh my gosh. Short. Maybe. Running out. Ah, it's 9:30.
Oh.
Okay, this is my beautiful wear and tear. Sorry. Let's say that's just it's just beautiful.
You got 1 minute left.
Okay, so I did a wear and tear layer, and then I'll select this UV, and because my texture is going to repeat at the top and the bottom, I can create a texture that is, say, like this,
I love the colors.
and I'll do something like this. This is my beautiful texture. I'll turn off my background copy. I'll save it as a PNG. I'll rename it to House Text. Instead of my images folder, I'll save it into my source images folder. Save it out. Large file, sure. Once you should technically be all done UV mapping. Sorry, I'm going over. You should be technically done UV mapping, so you could go to the original Lambert shader right here, and then just click on the UV grid and just change the texture to the new one that you just created. I also have to apply it to both so we can see it. So I'm holding right click on the shader and assign material to viewport. So I have my texture on here, and I've bolstered the form with it by making maybe one side a little bit darker. I put in a little bit of rough edge. You know, spend a lot more time on your texture than what I just did.
Ooh, actually, it's kind of cool because it's like cartoony.
Yeah. So this is looking, you know, okay. And because this geometry right here, see how the texture is repeating?
Mhm.
because the UVs are going to out past the 0 to 1 space, so the texture just keeps on repeating infinitely.
Huh. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
How about it? Does that not make sense? Does
No.
any of that not make sense?
So.
It makes
So-so.
perfect sense.
I was recording, so I'll put up 2 videos of this, so that there'll be the crit video, and it'll be harder to go through, and then there'll be this video to be able to stop, pause, listen, rewind.
So I have only one question.
Yeah.
So we're using Lambert here and not Arnold.
The reason I use Lambert is because, I mean, you can use Arnold.
But it takes longer.
No,
Well, it lags the computer point.
it should look exactly the same. AI standard, color, file, house, text. That's the process. Click on my geometry, apply here. So it looks exactly the same.
What about when you wonder?
The reason, the main reason I use a Lambert shader is because, one, I work in the video game industry, and shaders don't carry over to a video game engine. Arnold shader is specific to the Arnold render. So if I bring it into even an older version of Maya and it doesn't have Arnold, then none of my shaders will work and everything will be broken. So Lambert at its base is such a basic shader and understood shader that when I bring it to different places, there is a good chance that it won't be broken. When I'm putting a texture on it, I'm not having specular information like from a blend. I'm not having reflection information. I'm not having this information that is bothering me, and I'm just using the Lambert to just be able to see the texture. Once I'm 100% done with the texture, if I want to start adjusting my specularity, I put a specularity map, put a bump map, then I would move to the Arnold shader, but I would make sure I have some lighting in my scene so I can see how those new maps are responding to the lighting. Diffuse texture is one of the only textures that is influenced by lighting, but is not as, changed nearly as much as, say, a normal map or a bump map or a specular map. Like, those types of maps are really dictated by lighting. Texturing can be completely unlit, and you can understand what is maybe working and what is not working.
So is Arnold used for video games?
No.
No?
Arnold is used for commercials and movies.
Oh, so Lambert's used for video?
No.
No? What's used for video?
Lambert is used for, if I go to my render options, and if I go to render using, and I switch it to Maya software,
Mhm.
that's the only thing it's used for.
Oh, for video games?
No.
No. Ah,
So, but
what's used for video
for
games?
this assignment, we're using Lambert.
So that's a good question. We are 6 minutes over. I don't want to keep you guys because I know everyone's tired. But I'll send out an announcement. If I saw the class a little bit farther in the geometry, then I would suggest we could go into Unreal next class. But I think we're going to, I want to say we should render it like how we're going to render the car and put a high dynamic range image into the scene and render it that way. We might be running out of time to try and get it into the Unreal Engine. So with that, it's fine to use Lamberts to get your textures looking good. If we come to class next class, and everyone is in a really good spot for their geometry and in a really good spot with their texture, then maybe we can. I'll send out an announcement. I'd like to get it Unreal, but it's just a bit of a gray box. It just depends on making sure everyone is done with the work and there is more overlap with the car and HDRI lighting and making it look good, that there is that route too.
Alright. So what's used for video games?
What's used for video games?
Yeah.
Their own shaders.
Oh, okay.
None of these shaders go anywhere.
Oh,
Lambert's blends are Maya specific. Arnold shaders are Arnold specific. V-Ray shaders are V-Ray specific. Unity shaders are Unity specific.
so you do the shaders in the actual engine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we brought this to Unreal, we could just leave it as Lambert, and we would specify the shader in Unreal. If we do ended up rendering in Arnold, then we would use the Arnold shader, and we would stay within Maya and render it all together. We could still bring all your houses together into one scene and do a render, and see them all together. I think that would be pretty cool. But I'll send out an announcement to say this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that cool?
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? You're like, no, I want to go home. It's past my
It's
bedtime.
all over now.
All right, guys. Thank you for staying a little extra later,
Yeah.
and thanks for your undivided attention.
That means you gotta let us out